You know, it can be funny what piques your intellectual curiosity, where you find inspiration. This course was actually born from a moment, from a phrase I heard when I was out walking my dog about 5 years ago. Alan Stern, who had been in the space industry his entire life, related on a podcast that he believed that the space industry was about to explode.
What I think is that we're on the verge of this new decade, the 2020s, that I think will be the most exciting decade in the exploration of space, either since the 60s or ever. So I just think that the 20s are just going to be the roaring 20s for spaceflight.
And that gave me pause. That triggered a thought in my head. You see, we know how the roaring 20s ended. It wasn't great. I'm Glenn Torres-Spelliscy, and this is the podcast series for Space Law and Policy. Thanks for joining me this week. The early 20th century was undoubtedly a time of great optimism. America was awash in a spirit of invention. Automobiles rolled off of production lines. Refrigerators revolutionized American kitchens. And the transcontinental telephone line instantly connected Americans, forever changing how we communicate. It was a time when fortunes were being made and lost. The American economy was generating wealth like it never had before. America seemed poised on the precipice of something big, something grand. In 1928, presidential candidate Herbert Hoover campaigned on America's seemingly infinite promise.
We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. We shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation.
In the modern space industry, the echoes of the optimism from the 1920s have begun to reverberate again. Once again, it appears that we are poised on that precipice, looking out at a future where resources mined from asteroids are virtually unlimited, where endless energy from nuclear fusion has calmed the furnaces of the Industrial Revolution, powering us to new distances, and where humanity has settled our closest cosmic neighbors. Fortunately, we now know how the 1920s ended. Unfortunately, it was not a happy ending. As American writer and poet Malcolm Cowley wrote in his lyrical memoir, Exile's Return,
"Everywhere was the atmosphere of a long debauch that had to end. The orchestras played too fast. The stakes were too high at the gambling tables. The players were so empty, so tired, secretly hoping to vanish together into sleep."
This century's roaring 20s doesn't have to end in the same way, provided we heed the lessons learned over the past 2 centuries of American economic leadership. What are those lessons? What did we learn, not just from the Great Depression, but from the myriad of economic challenges that we have gone through in the past 200 years? Well, my career actually took me through the heart of the 2008 financial crisis. The law firm I worked at was housed in a building where Lehman Brothers controlled 25 or 30 floors. We watched it implode from the front lines. Day after day, people with boxes carrying personal effects exiting the lobbies. It also impacted the type of files that were coming across my desk. Various frauds had been exposed as the market collapsed, and lawsuits were being filed as wealthy investors and financial institutions sought to stem the losses. And as the country was searching for answers as to what could have catapulted the global economy to the brink of collapse, I recall learning about a partner working in my law firm's Washington, D.C. office, Brooksley Bourne. Bourne had been the head of the CFTC during the 1990s under the Clinton administration. While there, she began to sound the alarm about a little-known financial instrument, derivatives.
Providing me with an opportunity to testify concerning long-term capital management and its financial difficulties. This episode should serve as a wake-up call about the unknown risks in the over-the-counter derivatives market and the risks that might pose to the U.S. economy and to financial stability. It has highlighted an immediate and pressing need to address whether there are unacceptable regulatory gaps relating to hedge funds and other large OTC derivatives market participants.
Her primary concern was this was an unregulated market and it was starting to be worth a lot of money. Unregulated markets can be profitable in the short term, but they are ultimately unsustainable. They will eventually fall into the hands of crooks and charlatans, and once that happens, collapse is imminent. As Akerlof and Schiller explain,
if business people behave in the purely selfish and self-serving way that economic theory assumes, our free market system tends to spawn manipulation and deception. The problem is not that there are a lot of evil people. Most people play by the rules and are just trying to make a good living. But, inevitably, the competitive pressures for businessmen to practice deception and manipulation in free markets lead us to buy, and to pay too much for, products that we do not need, to work at jobs that give us little sense of purpose, and to wonder why our lives have gone amiss.
an unregulated, completely free market creates incentives for manipulation and deception, and the emergence of unscrupulous actors, the snake oil peddlers and the charlatans, is only a matter of time. And as the amount of manipulation and deception in a market grows, the amount of market share devoted to such schemes increases. The charlatans begin to take up more and more space, and the market's overall health suffers. And when too much of the economy becomes poisoned by the viral load of schemers and crooks, prosperity drifts out of the reach of much of the population, and eventually the system crashes. That was one of the primary lessons of both the Great Depression and the Great Recession. After both crises, the government stepped in to regulate the areas, and the economy rebuilt itself to greater heights. Now, as the space industry continues its exponential growth, we should heed Bourne's warning. It'll happen again if we don't take the appropriate steps. There will be significant financial downturns and disasters attributed to this regulatory gap over and over until we learn from experience. There are undeniably large gaps in the regulatory structure that govern human space exploration. And if we are to build a stable and prosperous market, we have to find ways to close them. Of course, we have to be careful in building out our regulatory structures too. There is a distinction between a well-regulated market and an over-regulated market. Indeed, over-regulated markets are just as injurious to progress as under-regulated markets. Too much control stymies creativity, limiting growth and opportunity. The prospect of captured regulators becomes a real possibility as powerful interests pour untold amounts of money into influencing regulators to look out for their needs, not the public's needs. History has shown us, however, that smart, targeted regulations can eliminate the bad actors by limiting the incentives for manipulative and deceptive practices, thereby allowing the objectively better products and providers to succeed. Indeed, smart regulations seek to balance the competing objectives of promoting innovation, stability, and consumer protection. This is where the idea of responsive regulation comes in. Successful relationships, including between an industry and its regulator, are a partnership. You have to be on the same team, rooting for and supporting each other's successes. You build something together, and that is how we have to view our relationship with the regulatory state. And that is how the regulatory state should view its relationship with us. It can't be a game of gotcha. We're not enemies or opponents. We must be allies so that we can build something prosperous together. And this is how I understand the theory of responsive regulation. Its idea is to create a regulatory structure that is responsive to the needs and activities of the industry it regulates, while at the same time meeting the policy goals of society at large. Ultimately, it is about developing partnerships between industry and agency, designed to promote growth. Because when regulated industry perceives the regulatory structure as fair and constructive, compliance becomes more likely, and there is less of a need to resort to punitive measures. So under a theory of responsive regulation, we can picture the relationship between the regulated and the regulator in a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, where regulatory activity should begin, we have the least amount of compulsory enforcement. Codes of compliance are largely voluntary, and the industry engages in substantial levels of self-regulation. A lot of the existing space regulations are at or near this level. But as the industry grows more complex, or as behavior begins to deteriorate, we can move up the regulatory pyramid to higher levels of enforcement, including performance and standard-based regulations, and finally, command and control regulations, which are the most intrusive and onerous to individual business, but often the best suited for protecting the interests of the community at large. Now, generally speaking, under the theory of responsive regulation, regulators should look to adopt the least intrusive approach possible, probably using a combination of the different levels of regulatory intervention. Enforcement activity should only be increased if the industry environment warrants it, but when it does warrant it, regulators must be empowered by the law to enact strict reforms and impose strict penalties. Vast areas of the new space economy remain underregulated, or worse, unregulated. International agreements, while they may contain valuable guiding principles, are dated. Fortunes are there to be made, but it is critical that we start to take steps now to mitigate the risks associated with such opportunity. Indeed, space is vast, mostly empty, and extraordinarily dangerous. We must take steps to protect our assets both on Earth and in the heavens from our non-terrestrial and terrestrial threats. Well, thanks for joining me this week. I look forward to seeing you next week and for another episode of the Space and Law and Policy Podcast series.